In the frozen heart of Alaska's Wrangell Mountains, where winter air can slice flesh like glass and darkness stretches across the land for most of the day, lies a chapter of American history so bleak that even those who uncovered it struggle to speak of it. Temperatures here can fall to 60 degrees below zero. Storms roll in without warning. Entire valleys vanish beneath drifting white sheets. Hidden somewhere inside that merciless wilderness was a story that remained buried under snow and silence for decades. It is the grim tale of Jacob and Ellenina Caldwell, two first cousins bound not just by blood, but by a lineage that had folded inward for generations. Their desperate bid to endure the winter of 1938 led them into a realm of horror most people cannot imagine, acts born out of starvation, madness, and a warped logic shaped by years of isolation. The origins of their story trace back to Copper Valley, an isolated outpost founded in 1893 by miners chasing fortunes they would never truly grasp. The wilderness swallowed many of them, but the ones who clung to the land formed small, tight-knit communities that rarely saw outsiders. Among those first settlers were two brothers, Thomas and William Caldwell, whose descendants would create a bloodline so inwardly entwined that by the time Jacob and Ellenina were born, nearly everyone carrying the Caldwell name shared at least one grandparent. The Caldwells stayed among their own, says historian Dr. Margaret Thornton, who pieced together this case over 15 years. According to her, the family's isolation wasn't simply the byproduct of geography, they nurtured it. They guarded their autonomy fiercely, turning away suitors from outside the enclave, marrying cousins upon cousins, reinforcing a belief passed down like scripture, that their endurance in Alaska's hostile interior was proof their blood was superior and must remain unmixed. Jacob Caldwell entered the world in 1908, born to William Caldwell Jr. and his cousin wife Sarah. He carried the unmistakable physical signs of multi-generational inbreeding, eyes so narrowly spaced they seemed almost fused, a brow that jutted forward, and a frame far smaller than that of an average adult man. A traveling doctor wrote in a 1932 journal that Jacob showed signs of a sluggish mind, though capable of bursts of surprising cunning. Ellenina Caldwell, born 4 years later, mirrored many of Jacob's traits. Her hands curved unnaturally, her mouth pulled to one side, and neighbors spoke in whispers about her violent outbursts, moments where rage would take her like a seizure. Despite the murmurs, when the cousins married in 1933, few in the community were shocked. It was just another Caldwell union. What made them different was their decision to flee even deeper into the mountains, farther than any Caldwell before them. They built a small homestead in a valley reachable only through a narrow mountain pass that snow sealed off each winter. They weren't escaping judgment, anthropologist William Hayes explains. They were continuing a family tradition, pushing isolation to its extreme. By the winter of 1937, Ellenina had brought 3 children into the world. All bore the crushing weight of their parents' shared genes. Thomas, the eldest at 4, suffered from debilitating seizures and had never spoken. Mary, just 2, was born with a severe cleft palate that made feeding her an ordeal. The youngest, James, an infant born that spring, had a massively enlarged head and couldn't lift it without assistance. These children represent the mathematical consequences of repeated consanguinity, explains geneticist Dr. Sarah Chun. In populations where relatives continually reproduce, dangerous recessive traits no longer hide, they surface, sometimes catastrophically. Then came the winter of 1937 to 1938, harsher and earlier than anyone in Copper Valley could remember. Heavy snows sealed the path to town by October. Jacob, weakened by what Ellenina later called his sickness spells, likely depressive episodes, had failed to prepare adequate food stores. Game retreated to lower ground long before the first blizzard. By December, hunger gnawed at them like a living creature. The truth of that winter would have vanished forever if not for a discovery 14 years later. But the first clues lay in a battered journal Ellenina kept, her handwriting crooked and childlike, written on scraps torn from an old Sears catalogue. The entry dated January 16, 1938, reads, "The boy gone today. Jacob says God told him. The little ones need meat. We keep all the parts we can." Those chilling words signaled the beginning of what scholars now call the Caldwell Winter Atrocity. Thomas, already frail from hunger and his many ailments, became the first casualty. Forensic experts would later conclude he did not starve, his death was intentional. What followed was described in the journal with a cold practicality that horrified even seasoned investigators. Ilelanina wrote about her son's remains as though she were processing a trapped animal. This wasn't raw survival instinct, says criminal historian Robert Jameson. There is a flatness in her language, a complete absence of grief. By February, the winter had tightened its grip. Snow piled against their cabin walls. Ice formed inside their windows. Temperatures plunged to levels that made breath freeze midair. Their supplies dwindled again. Another journal entry marked the end of Mary's life. Mary gone to God. We do as before. Her small body was handled like her brother's, portioned, stored in the sub-zero shed outside their home. Investigators decades later found evidence consistent with butchering techniques used on wild game. For forensic psychologist Dr. Ilan Morris, the Caldwell case sits at the crossroads of three devastating forces: genetic impairment, severe physical isolation, and the crushing pressure of starvation. Their moral framework was already weakened, she notes. Combine that with isolation and the brutality of Alaskan winter, and they developed a warped religious rationalization for their actions. The most disturbing implication came from an entry dated March 9, 1938. Baby cries too much. Jacob says it is time. Tomorrow God gives us food again. Infant James had not died naturally. Somehow, through ritual, delusion, or sheer survival instinct, Jacob and Ilelanina managed to live until the thaw of late April. When the mountain pass finally cleared, Jacob appeared in Copper Valley thin but composed, not emaciated. He purchased ammunition, staples, and startlingly, cloth for new children's clothing. He was planning replacements, Dr. Morris suggests. By June, as the journal later revealed, Ilelanina was pregnant again. The Caldwell winter might have become another lost tragedy swallowed by the wilderness if not for what happened in 1952. Alaska, preparing for statehood, was being surveyed for future roads and infrastructure. Two surveyors, Michael Donovan and Peter Keene, stumbled upon the long-abandoned Caldwell homestead. The main cabin had partially collapsed, but the storage shed, because of the frigid, arid climate, remained eerily intact. Inside, Donovan found something that would follow him for the rest of his life. Small bones, unmistakably human, he wrote. Cut cleanly, boiled in places. Wrapped in the corner was a journal. Parts of his report remained classified for more than 20 years. Federal authorities quietly investigated, worried the discovery would spark hysteria or damage Alaska's image as it inched toward statehood. They soon learned Jacob had died in 1949 from a genetic liver disorder common in families with extensive inbreeding. Ilelanina had moved back to the Caldwell enclave with 3 new children, each suffering from the same types of abnormalities as her first. According to locals, she called them Thomas, Mary, and James, as if the originals had never died. When federal agents interviewed her in 1952, they encountered a woman crumbling under both physical and mental deterioration. Though only 40, she appeared decades older. Cataract clouded her eyes. Arthritis had twisted her fingers into near immobility. She referred to all 6 children, living and dead, as though they were still present. When pressed about the winter of 1938, she answered only, "We did what was needed. The blood must stay strong." Hair samples confirmed one of the highest levels of genetic homozygosity ever recorded, comparable to the most inbred royal families of Europe. Even though Jacob and Ilelanina were legally first cousins, their genetic similarity was close to that of half-siblings due to 4 previous generations of cousin marriages. Dr. Chun describes their genome as a concentrated vault of recessive disorders. The consequences reached far beyond physical deformity. Medical records from a missionary doctor who visited Copper Valley noted something unsettling: many Caldwell children lacked empathy in ways that defied typical developmental patterns. Their moral reasoning was compromised long before starvation set in, explains neuropsychologist Dr. Henry Wilson. They were trapped inside their biology. Researchers would later argue that the winter of 1938 wasn't just a tragedy born of isolation, it was the inevitable collision between collapsing genetics and collapsing morality. The Caldwell lineage had been tightening in on itself for so many generations that the boundary between survival instinct and pathology had blurred beyond recognition. By the mid-1950s, the family's internal decline had become impossible to hide. Birth defects grew more pronounced with each generation: spinal curvatures, malformed jaws, vision loss, and cognitive impairments that worsened under the crushing solitude of the mountains. Yet the elders insisted this was the price of purity, a mantra repeated so frequently that even the physically healthy among them accepted it without question. Dr. Chun's later analysis paints a bleak picture. Had the line continued without intervention, total genetic collapse was only 1 or 2 generations away. But the cultural collapse happened first. When Eleanina died in 1956, alone, half-blind, and raving about her 6 babies sleeping in the snow, state investigators finally descended on Copper Valley. What they found wasn't a functioning community but the remnants of one: cabin sinking into moss, paths swallowed by undergrowth, and a burial field with markers so weathered they resembled driftwood. The last Caldwell descendants who remained were taken into medical custody, many suffering from severe developmental disorders. Among the possessions removed from the property was a locked wooden chest. Its contents wouldn't be catalogued publicly until the early 2000s. Inside were 3 notebooks wrapped in oiled cloth, likely weatherproofed by Jacob himself. The pages contained a mixture of genealogical records, ritual observations, and fragmented diary entries. The writing grew increasingly incoherent across the years, sentences trailing off, words repeated obsessively, entire sections scratched out violently with graphite. One entry, dated late 1938, chilled archivists. Snow has eaten our days. The children don't hear the voices of God anymore. They hear each other in ways they shouldn't. Another, unsigned and undated, appeared to describe the final days of Thomas, Mary, and James. They sleep near the stove now. Not from warmth, but because the shadows stay away from the heat. Their bones feel glass thin. Mary's eyes don't look like hers anymore. Forensic linguists believe multiple family members wrote in the notebooks over the span of 2 decades. Disturbingly, some handwriting samples matched that of children under 10 years old, hinting that even the youngest were documenting the family's unraveling in their own disordered way. A final note, likely Eleanina's, contained only 3 words. "We kept faithful." After the enclave's dissolution, the remaining Caldwell children were dispersed into state care. Many struggled with lifelong disabilities. A few lived into adulthood but refused all interviews, reportedly terrified the past would resurface. In 1974, Dr. Wilson conducted follow-up neurological testing on 2 surviving descendants. His report, later unsealed, offered a grim conclusion. The Caldwell lineage demonstrates one of the most extreme cases of hereditary cognitive disintegration ever recorded in North America. Emotional processing centers showed significant underdevelopment. Social comprehension was nearly absent. These were not behaviors learned from trauma alone, they were etched into biology. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation came from a detail buried in an appendix. Despite their impairments, both subjects described vivid recurring dreams. Dreams of snow-covered children calling from under the floorboards. Dreams of the stove glowing too bright. Dreams of a mother who didn't die. Experts still debate whether these memories were fragments of early childhood, or something else passed down within the family's fractured collective consciousness. Whatever the truth, the Caldwell story didn't fade quietly. In the decades that followed, hikers in the Copper Valley region occasionally reported strange encounters, silhouettes moving through the trees at dusk, distant wailing on windless nights, or the sensation of being watched by more than one pair of eyes. No physical evidence ever confirmed these claims, but Alaska state troopers received enough calls to list the area as cautionary for solo travel well into the 1990s. Today, the remnants of the Caldwell homestead sit behind a chain-link fence, overgrown and half-claimed by the forest. The main cabin's roof finally collapsed in the early 2000s, burying any remaining artifacts beneath rotting beams and decades of moss. But locals insist that what the earth reclaimed, it did not silence. Some believe the 3 children, Thomas, Mary, and James, never truly died in 1938. That something of them lingered, carried through generations in whispers, behaviors, and dreams. A haunting not born of spirits, but of blood. As Dr. Chun summarized in a rare interview, trauma can echo for a lifetime. But when trauma is encoded into DNA, it can echo for centuries. The Caldwell legacy, however, did not end entirely in tragedy. By the 1970s, researchers tracking surviving descendants noticed subtle shifts in their biology and behavior. As genetic diversity was finally introduced throughout marriage, the most severe recessive disorders gradually diminished. Within just 2 to 3 generations, previously pervasive conditions, severe cognitive impairments, crippling neurological disorders, and emotional dysregulation began to fade. The human genome is remarkably resilient, Dr. Chun explains. Even after centuries of concentrated inbreeding, the reintroduction of genetic variation can restore health in surprisingly few generations. The Caldwell children, once trapped in a closed loop of heredity, had inadvertently provided a case study in both the consequences of isolation and the power of genetic renewal. Alaska itself had transformed in parallel. Roads, air travel, and social services eroded the isolation that had allowed the Caldwells' extreme practices to persist. Remote communities became connected. Education reached distant valleys. Medical oversight improved. And with that, the social and moral pressures that had perpetuated the family's extreme isolation began to dissolve. Yet the story left an indelible mark, not just on genetics or anthropology, but on the collective memory of Alaska. Locals still speak in hushed tones about the Caldwell Winter, a cautionary tale of what happens when human beings are cut off from the moderating influence of broader society. Historian Thomas Mackenzie notes, the horror of what Jacob and Elelonina did is only half the story. The more troubling part is that the community allowed it to continue for generations. Psychologists and anthropologists have examined the case to understand how moral frameworks can be reshaped in isolation. The Caldwells did not see themselves as criminals, they were acting according to an internal logic, one in which purity of blood and obedience to an imagined divine will trump conventional ethics. Cultural anthropologist Dr. Lisa Chun observes, the Caldwells developed a worldview where genetic diversity was contamination. Sacrifice, even of their own children, became a ritualistic extension of preserving the family line. Indeed, parallels exist in other isolated societies, both historical and contemporary. Extreme isolation combined with intermarriage can foster beliefs and practices that seem abhorrent to outsiders but are internally rationalized within the community. The Caldwells were an extreme case, but not entirely unique. Archaeological excavations at the homestead in 1998 revealed additional layers of evidence. Forensic anthropologists recovered bone fragments consistent with prior generations, suggesting that cannibalistic survival strategies may have been an inherited custom, practiced in earlier harsh winters when survival depended on the family's rigid, inward-looking logic. These findings underscore a disturbing pattern. In the absence of external oversight, human societies can develop moral and ethical codes entirely divorced from the larger world. Anthropologists studying extreme isolation, from frontier settlements to long-term space missions, use the Caldwell case to model how small groups might diverge psychologically and ethically when removed from societal norms. Yet despite the darkness, the Caldwell story also offers a rare glimmer of hope. Within decades, the introduction of new bloodlines restored health and stability. By the late 20th century, surviving descendants were integrated into society, no longer confined to the genetic and moral trap that defined their ancestors. DNA testing confirmed that with genetic diversity, most severe disorders had virtually disappeared. The homestead itself, once the stage for unspeakable acts, was deliberately burned in 1953 by authorities, a symbolic act intended to erase the physical remnants of a grim chapter. Maps recorded the site only as an abandoned settlement until historical preservation standards forced proper documentation in 1978. Today, it remains unmarked, accessible only through a grueling hike into the still wild Alaskan interior. Few locals will guide visitors, and those who know the story prefer silence. The psychological and cultural legacy lingers, however. Stories of the Caldwells have entered Alaskan folklore, haunting the imagination of those who grew up hearing about Copper Valley's secret family. Investigators, historians, and geneticists alike return to the story repeatedly, not just for its shock value but for what it reveals about human vulnerability to isolation, heredity, and survival pressure. Medical researchers continue to reference what they call the Caldwell effect, observing how multi-generational inbreeding magnifies recessive disorders. From a psychological perspective, Elelonina's journals remain a rare window into the cognitive distortions that extreme isolation and genetic predisposition can produce. Her writings show no recognition of wrongdoing. In her perception, every act, no matter how horrifying, was justified, necessary, and divinely sanctioned. Anthropologists note that such moral inversion is a predictable phenomenon in isolated groups. Similar patterns appear in remote religious communities and secluded geographic enclaves where intermarriage is common. Social norms shift, ethical codes diverge, and acts considered abhorrent externally become normalized internally. The Caldwells represent an extreme, yet textbook, manifestation of this dynamic. In the end, the Caldwell narrative is both a cautionary tale and a testament to resilience. It illustrates the catastrophic consequences of genetic isolation, extreme environmental hardship, and moral divergence, while simultaneously demonstrating that human genetics, given opportunity for renewal, can recover astonishingly quickly. Jacob and Elelonina Caldwell's story, with all its darkness, stands as a reminder that civilization is fragile. Isolate a family, or any society, from its ethical, social, and genetic anchors, and even the most basic moral intuitions can erode. Conversely, the story shows that intervention, diversity, and connection to the broader human community can heal even generations of compounded suffering. The bones of Thomas, Mary, and James, once scattered and hidden, finally received a proper, quiet burial in Anchorage decades later. And though the mountains of Alaska remain as unforgiving as ever, the echoes of the Caldwell winter are no longer a secret. They linger in memory, in lessons learned, and in the very DNA of descendants who survived to tell a story of darkness overcome by resilience. If you reflect on the depth of this history, you understand the fragile balance between isolation and connection, heredity and choice, survival and morality. The Caldwell case is more than horror, it is a window into human vulnerability, and a stark warning of what happens when the forces of nature, blood, and human psychology converge in a place far from the world's eyes.